Steve Harvey, the man everyone knew for his laughter-filled talk shows and quick-witted jokes, had a side to him that many didn't see often, a side that cared deeply about real-world problems. Behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, Steve had been paying close attention to news stories about police behavior and how people from different walks of life were treated. He was especially troubled by reports of unfair treatment toward those who were homeless or struggling financially. These stories stayed with him, gnawing at his conscience. One evening, after wrapping up another successful episode of his show, Steve found himself sitting in his cozy living room with a group of friends. The conversation turned serious as they discussed recent events involving law enforcement and vulnerable communities. Someone mentioned how some officers went out of their way to help, while others seemed indifferent, or worse, hostile, toward people on the streets. This sparked an idea in Steve's mind. What if he could step into the shoes of someone less fortunate? What if he could experience firsthand what it felt like to be ignored or judged based solely on appearance? At first, the thought seemed crazy, even to Steve. After all, he was a celebrity, someone whose face was recognized worldwide. How could he possibly blend in with the crowd? But the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. If no one knew it was him under the disguise, he could truly understand what life was like for those who lived on the margins of society. It wouldn't just be an experiment, it would be a test of humanity, his own included. The plan began taking shape almost immediately. Steve decided he would pose as a homeless man in downtown Los Angeles, a city known for its stark contrast between wealth and poverty. He wanted to observe not only how ordinary people reacted, but also how law enforcement treated someone they assumed was homeless. Would they offer help, or would they dismiss him as someone unworthy of their time? The idea excited him, but it also made him nervous. He wasn't sure what to expect, and that uncertainty fueled his determination. To make the experiment authentic, Steve knew he couldn't cut corners. His usual polished look, the tailored suits, the shiny shoes, the perfectly groomed mustache, would have to go. Instead, he envisioned himself wearing ragged clothing, carrying a makeshift cardboard sign, and pushing a shopping cart filled with random belongings. The transformation needed to be so convincing that even his closest friends wouldn't recognize him. For a man accustomed to standing in the spotlight, the idea of becoming invisible was both thrilling and daunting. As the days passed, Steve prepared meticulously. He read books and articles about homelessness, trying to understand the challenges faced by those living on the streets. He spoke to experts and listened to personal stories shared online. Each account painted a vivid picture of struggle, resilience, and sometimes despair. By the time he was ready to step into character, Steve felt a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, and a deep sense of responsibility. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he believed it was worth it. Little did he know, the journey ahead would change him in ways he never imagined. With everything planned and his heart set on making a difference, Steve took a deep breath and committed to seeing the experiment through. He reminded himself that this wasn't about fame or ratings. It was about shining a light on an issue that mattered. As he prepared to leave behind the comforts of his luxurious lifestyle, he wondered, would people see past his disguise? Or would they treat him like any other person forgotten by society? Only time would tell. The morning of the big transformation arrived, and Steve Harvey was both excited and nervous. He stood in front of a team of professional makeup artists and wardrobe specialists who were tasked with turning him into someone completely unrecognizable. This wasn't just about slapping on some dirt or throwing on old clothes, it had to be convincing. For hours, the team worked meticulously, layering grime onto his face, tousling his hair until it looked unwashed and unkempt, and even adding subtle details like fake stubble to age him slightly. The goal was simple: make Steve disappear. When the final touches were done, Steve stepped in front of the mirror, and for a moment he didn't recognize himself. Gone was the polished TV personality with the sharp suits and confident grin. In his place stood a man who looked weathered, tired, and invisible, an ordinary figure you'd pass on the street without a second thought. The transformation was so complete that even Steve felt a pang of unease. "Wow," he muttered, staring at his reflection. "This is wild." But the makeover didn't stop there. To truly sell the act, Steve needed the right props. He was given a pair of worn-out sneakers, patched-up jeans, and a faded flannel shirt that smelled faintly of smoke. A tattered jacket completed the look, along with a mismatched pair of gloves missing fingers. For added realism, the team handed him a shopping cart filled with random items: a cardboard box, an empty soda can, a crumpled blanket, and a few plastic bags stuffed with scraps. It was everything a typical homeless person might carry, down to the smallest detail. As Steve practiced walking with a slight shuffle and speaking in a softer, more hesitant voice, he began to feel the weight of his new identity. Every step seemed heavier, every movement deliberate. He realized how much effort went into maintaining his usual persona, how standing tall, dressing sharply, and exuding confidence came naturally to him in his everyday life. Now, as this new version of himself, he felt stripped of all those layers. It was humbling, almost surreal. Before heading out, Steve took one last look in the mirror. He reminded himself of the purpose behind this experiment: to experience life from a perspective far removed from his own, to challenge assumptions, and to see if people would treat him differently when they didn't know who he was. With a deep breath, he nodded at the team and stepped outside. The bright sunlight hit his face, and for the first time in years, he felt truly anonymous. Walking through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, Steve quickly noticed how invisible he had become. People hurried past him, their eyes glued to their phones or fixed straight ahead. Some crossed the street to avoid getting too close, while others barely glanced in his direction. It was a strange feeling, being surrounded by crowds yet feeling utterly alone. At one point, a child tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at him, but the woman quickly ushered her away, shaking her head. Steve couldn't help but chuckle sadly at the irony. Here he was, a household name, and no one even gave him a second glance. Despite the initial discomfort, Steve found moments of unexpected connection. An elderly man sitting on a bench offered him half of his sandwich, mistaking him for another soul in need. A young couple paused to drop a few coins into his makeshift cup. These small acts of kindness reminded him that humanity still existed, even in places where it seemed scarce. Yet with each passing hour, the reality of his situation grew clearer. Being homeless wasn't just about lacking shelter. It was about feeling erased, overlooked, and dismissed by society. By the end of the day, Steve was physically and emotionally drained. His back ached from leaning against cold walls and his stomach growled from skipping meals. But what weighed on him most was the realization of how easy it was to ignore someone once they were labeled as other. As he returned to his temporary, safe house to rest, he couldn't shake the image of himself in the mirror earlier that morning. Who was this man? And why did the world treat him so differently now? The days that followed were unlike anything Steve Harvey had ever experienced. Waking up each morning in his disguise, he began to settle into the rhythm of life on the streets, a life that was far removed from the comfort and predictability of his usual routine. He learned quickly that survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter. It was about navigating a world where people either ignored you completely or treated you with suspicion. Every interaction carried its own lesson, some heartbreaking and others surprisingly uplifting. Morning started early for Steve as he joined the long line outside a local soup kitchen. The air was often cold, and the ground beneath his feet felt hard and unforgiving. As he waited patiently, he noticed how everyone around him seemed to carry their own invisible burdens. Some chatted quietly, sharing stories of lost jobs, broken families, or health struggles. Others sat silently, their eyes reflecting years of hardship. Steve listened intently, absorbing every word. He realized that homelessness wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It was a complex web of circumstances, choices, and sometimes sheer bad luck. When it was finally his turn to receive a plate of food, Steve couldn't help but feel a mix of gratitude and sadness. The volunteers serving meals greeted him warmly, calling him sir, and asking if he needed anything else. Their kindness stood in stark contrast to the indifference he'd encountered elsewhere. For a brief moment he felt seen again, as though someone cared enough to acknowledge his humanity. But as soon as he stepped away from the counter, that feeling faded. Back on the street, he was once again just another face in the crowd. During the afternoons, Steve wandered through parks and alleyways observing the ebb and flow of city life. He tried begging for change near busy intersections, holding out a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." Most people walked past without making eye contact, their expressions blank or hurried. Some even scowled, as though his presence offended them. But there were exceptions, moments when strangers stopped to drop $1 or $2 into his cup. One woman, clutching her purse tightly, hesitated before handing him a granola bar. "I hope this helps," she said, softly offering a small smile. Those fleeting connections reminded Steve that compassion still existed, even in the busiest corners of the city. Nights were the hardest part. With nowhere to go, Steve curled up on a park bench, using the thin blanket he'd been given earlier. The temperature dropped quickly, and the sound of distant traffic kept him awake for hours. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by the occasional shout or siren wailing in the distance. It was during these quiet, lonely moments that Steve reflected on his privilege. How many times had he taken simple things like a warm bed or a roof over his head for granted? Now, stripped of those comforts, he understood just how fragile stability could be. Despite the challenges, Steve found himself drawn to the resilience of those around him. There was an older man named Joe who always greeted him with a nod and a joke no matter how tough things got. "You gotta laugh," Joe told him one evening. "If you don't, this life will eat you alive." Then there was a young girl named Lily, barely 16, who confided in Steve about running away from an abusive home. Her courage amazed him, even as her situation broke his heart. These conversations humanized the statistics Steve had read about homelessness. They weren't just numbers. They were real people with dreams, fears, and untold stories. As the days passed, Steve grew more accustomed to his new reality, but it never became easy. Each day brought new lessons: the importance of community among the unhoused, the stigma attached to being poor, and the sheer exhaustion of living without basic necessities. Yet amidst the struggle, he also discovered moments of beauty in the shared laughter of strangers, the generosity of passers-by, and the quiet strength of those who refused to give up. By the time he returned to his temporary safe house each night, Steve's mind was racing with thoughts and emotions. This experiment was teaching him more than he'd ever imagined, and he knew the most challenging part was yet to come. It was a chilly afternoon when Steve Harvey's experiment took an unexpected turn. He had been sitting on a worn-out bench, near a busy intersection, his shopping cart parked beside him when 2 police officers approached. Their boots clicked against the pavement as they walked toward him with purposeful strides. Steve's heart began to race, not out of fear for his safety, but because he knew this moment would reveal so much about how authority figures treated those living on the streets. "Hey, you," one of the officers called out, his tone firm and commanding. "What are you doing here?" Steve looked up slowly, playing the part of someone who had grown accustomed to being dismissed. "Just sitting," he replied hesitantly, his voice softer than usual. The second officer crossed, his arms studying Steve closely. "Do you have ID on you?" "No, sir," Steve answered, shaking his head slightly. "I don't carry anything like that." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. "You can't just sit here all day," the first officer said, his patience visibly thinning. "This isn't a place for loitering. Move along." Steve nodded meekly, pretending not to understand fully. "Where should I go?" he asked, his tone humble and unsure. "We're not here to give advice," the second officer snapped. "Just get moving before we have to take further action." The word action hung in the air like a threat. Steve felt a chill run down his spine, not because he believed they'd actually arrest him, but because of what this interaction represented. Here he was, a man who had spent decades entertaining millions and earning respect across industries. Yet in this moment, he was reduced to nothing more than a nuisance, a problem to be dealt with swiftly and without empathy. As Steve gathered his belongings and pushed his shopping cart away from the area, he couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind. The officers hadn't raised their voices or used physical force, but their dismissive attitude spoke volumes. They hadn't asked if he needed help or if he was okay. Instead, they saw him as an obstacle to clear. It was a stark reminder of how easy it was for people in positions of power to overlook the humanity of others. Later that evening, back at his temporary safe house, Steve reflected on the incident. He thought about how differently things might have gone if he'd revealed his true identity right then and there. Would the officers have apologized, laughed nervously, or worse, would they have doubled down, embarrassed by their behavior? Part of him wanted to test that theory, but he resisted. This experiment wasn't about exposing individuals. It was about understanding systems and patterns. What struck Steve most was the contrast between this encounter and the kindness he'd received from ordinary citizens earlier in the week. While many passers-by had ignored him, some had shown genuine care, offering food, spare change, or even a kind word. But these officers, tasked with protecting and serving, hadn't extended that same courtesy. Instead, they had treated him as though he didn't deserve their time or attention. Still, Steve refused to let bitterness take root. He reminded himself that not every officer acted this way. He'd heard stories of cops going above and beyond to help those in need, and he hoped to witness such acts during his experiment. For now, though, this interaction served as a powerful lesson, one that highlighted the gap between policy and practice, between what society promised and what it delivered. That night, as Steve lay on his makeshift bed, he replayed the conversation over and over again in his mind. He thought about the countless men and women who faced similar treatment daily, not because of anything they'd done wrong, but simply because of where life had left them. The weight of it all settled heavily on his chest, but it also fueled his determination to keep going. If nothing else, this experience was proving to be exactly what he'd hoped it would be: eye-opening, humbling, and unforgettable. The next evening, as Steve Harvey pushed his shopping cart through the dimly lit streets of downtown Los Angeles, he spotted a small group of people gathered near a community center. Curious, he wandered closer and noticed a young woman handing out blankets to those in need. Her bright smile stood out against the grayness of the surroundings, and there was an unmistakable warmth in her voice as she spoke to each person individually. Something about her caught Steve's attention, and he decided to approach her. "Excuse me," Steve said softly, trying to sound hesitant but polite. "What's going on here?" The young woman turned to him, her eyes kind and inviting. "We're just giving out some supplies for the night," she explained. "It gets pretty cold out here, so we want to make sure everyone has something to keep warm." Steve nodded, pretending to be grateful. "That's real nice of you," he murmured. Taking a blanket from her hands, "I'm Maria." She introduced herself, extending a hand. "Do you come around here often?" "Not really," Steve replied, shaking her hand gently. "Just trying to get by, you know?" Maria nodded sympathetically. "I hear you. Life can be tough sometimes." She paused for a moment, studying him carefully. "If you ever need a hot meal or somewhere safe to rest for a bit, there's a shelter not too far from here. I volunteer there every week. You should stop by." Her words struck a chord with Steve. In all his days posing as homeless, he hadn't met anyone quite like Maria. While others had shown brief flashes of kindness, she seemed genuinely invested in making a difference. Her sincerity intrigued him, and he found himself wanting to learn more about her. Over the next hour, they sat together on the steps of the community center, talking quietly while the city buzzed around them. Maria shared pieces of her own story, how she'd grown up in a low-income neighborhood, struggled to afford college, and eventually found purpose in helping others. "I've seen what it's like to feel invisible," she told him, "and I don't want anyone else to go through that alone." Steve listened intently, moved by her determination. Despite her challenges, Maria radiated hope and resilience. She talked passionately about her dream of becoming a lawyer someday, using her education to fight for justice and advocate for marginalized communities. "People deserve better than this," she said firmly, gesturing toward the streets around them. "No one should have to live like this if we can help it." As their conversation deepened, Steve felt a growing admiration for Maria. Here was someone who understood hardship firsthand, yet refused to let it define her. Instead, she channeled her experiences into action, working tirelessly to create change. It was a powerful reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, light could still shine through. Before parting ways, Maria handed Steve another blanket and encouraged him to visit the shelter. "Promise me you'll at least check it out," she urged. "You don't have to face this alone," Steve promised, though he knew he wouldn't actually go. Still, her compassion left a lasting impression on him. As he walked away, pushing his cart down the empty sidewalk, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Maria represented everything he hoped to highlight through this experiment: the potential for empathy, connection, and meaningful action in a world that often felt indifferent. That night, as Steve lay awake reflecting on his day, he realized how much impact one person could have. Maria's kindness wasn't just about giving blankets or offering advice. It was about seeing people as individuals worthy of care and respect. In a way, she had given him something invaluable: a renewed sense of hope. And unbeknownst to her, their meeting would soon become a pivotal moment in his journey, setting the stage for the revelations that were yet to come. The next day, Steve Harvey returned to the same street corner where he had spent so many hours blending into the background. But this time things were different. A film crew discreetly positioned themselves nearby, cameras rolling as Steve prepared to reveal his true identity. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, not just from the crew, but from Steve himself. He knew this moment would be pivotal, not only for his experiment but also for the message he wanted to send. As pedestrians hurried past him, oblivious to his presence, Steve took a deep breath and stepped forward. Standing in the middle of the sidewalk, he raised his hand slightly to catch people's attention. At first, no one noticed. They sidestepped him, assuming he was just another panhandler looking for change. But then, Steve spoke up, his voice louder and more confident than it had been in days. "Hey everyone," he called out. "Can I have your attention for a second?" A few heads turned, curiosity piqued by the sudden interruption to their routines. Slowly, a small crowd began to gather around him. Steve smiled, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. Then, without hesitation, he reached up and wiped away some of the dirt from his face. Beneath the grime, his familiar features started to emerge: the sharp jawline, the unmistakable mustache. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized who they were looking at. "It's Steve Harvey," someone shouted, pointing in disbelief. Murmurs erupted as the onlookers tried to process what they were seeing. Some pulled out their phones to record the moment, while others simply stared, mouths agape. For most of them, it was incomprehensible that the man they'd walked past countless times over the past few days was actually one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Steve let the initial shock settle before speaking again. "I know this might come as a surprise," he began, his tone warm and genuine. "But for the last several days I've been living among you, posing as a homeless man to better understand what life is like for those who are often overlooked." He went on to share snippets of his experience, describing the kindness of strangers, the indifference of passers-by, and the unsettling encounter with law enforcement. His words painted a vivid picture of both the struggles and the resilience he had witnessed. The crowd listened intently, hanging on to every word. Many nodded in agreement, while others looked visibly moved. Just as Steve finished recounting his story, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the growing crowd. It was Maria, the young woman who had shown him such compassion the night before. She froze mid-step when she saw Steve standing there, now clearly recognizable. Confusion flickered across her face as she pieced together the truth. "Maria," Steve called out, waving her over. "Come here." She hesitated for a moment before making her way through the crowd. When she finally stood in front of him, her eyes wide with disbelief, Steve grinned. "Remember me?" he asked gently. Maria blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. "Wait, are you serious right now?" she stammered. "That was you last night." Steve nodded, his expression softening. "It was me. And I have to say, meeting you meant a lot to me. You reminded me why I'm doing this, to highlight the good that still exists, even in tough situations." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as the weight of the moment hit her. She had unknowingly touched the heart of someone who could amplify her mission in ways she never imagined. Overwhelmed, she managed a shaky smile. "Wow," she whispered. "This is crazy." Steve placed a hand on her shoulder, his gratitude evident. "You inspired me, Maria. Your kindness, your determination. It's exactly what we need more of in this world." With the crowd still gathered around, Steve announced that he wanted to partner with Maria to bring awareness to homelessness and advocate for systemic change. He promised to use his platform to support her dreams of becoming a lawyer and fighting for justice. Cheers erupted from the audience, many clapping and cheering enthusiastically. For Maria, it was a surreal and emotional moment. For Steve, it was validation that his experiment had achieved its purpose, not just to expose societal flaws, but to celebrate the humanity that connected them all. As the cameras continued rolling, capturing every raw emotion, Steve couldn't help but feel hopeful. This wasn't the end of his journey, it was only the beginning. The revelation of Steve Harvey's social experiment sent ripples far beyond the streets of downtown Los Angeles. Within hours, footage of his transformation and heartfelt interactions began circulating online, sparking conversations across social media platforms, news outlets, and even dinner tables. People were captivated, not just by the shock of seeing a celebrity in disguise, but by the deeper message behind his actions. For Steve, this was more than a personal journey. It was an opportunity to ignite meaningful change. True to his word, Steve wasted no time in partnering with Maria to amplify their shared mission. Together, they launched a campaign called See the Person, aimed at raising awareness about homelessness and advocating for systemic reforms within law enforcement and community support systems. The name itself was inspired by Maria's unwavering belief that everyone deserved to be seen as a human being first, regardless of their circumstances. It was simple yet powerful, a reminder that empathy could bridge divides. Steve used his influence to organize town hall meetings, bringing together activists, policymakers, and everyday citizens to discuss solutions. These forums weren't just about airing grievances. They were about collaboration. Speakers included formerly homeless individuals sharing their stories, police officers discussing ways to improve training, and nonprofit leaders outlining programs that worked. Maria played a key role in these discussions, her passion and firsthand knowledge adding depth and authenticity to the conversations. Her dream of becoming a lawyer suddenly felt closer than ever, thanks to Steve's mentorship and financial backing. In addition to advocacy work, Steve made substantial donations to shelters, outreach programs, and organizations dedicated to helping the unhoused population. He didn't stop there. He encouraged his fans and followers to contribute in whatever way they could, whether through volunteering, donating supplies, or simply offering kindness to someone in need. Social media lit up with hashtags like See the Person and Be the Change, as people around the world shared how they were inspired to take action in their own communities. One of the most impactful moments came when Steve invited Maria to appear on his talk show. Sitting across from him on the brightly lit stage, she spoke candidly about her experiences growing up in poverty and her determination to create a better future. The audience listened in awe, many moved to tears by her resilience and optimism. When Steve surprised her with a full scholarship to law school funded by his foundation, the entire room erupted into applause. It was a life-changing moment for Maria, one that underscored the power of using privilege to uplift others. But Steve didn't let the momentum fade after the initial buzz. He continued hosting segments on his show, highlighting stories of hope and perseverance, shining a spotlight on individuals and organizations making a difference. Each episode ended with a call to action, urging viewers to get involved in their local communities. Whether it was volunteering at a food bank, supporting affordable housing initiatives, or pushing for policy changes, Steve emphasized that every effort mattered. The campaign also caught the attention of lawmakers, prompting discussions about increasing funding for mental health services, addiction recovery programs, and job training for those transitioning out of homelessness. While progress took time, the increased visibility brought pressure for tangible results. Communities began implementing pilot programs designed to address root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. Through it all, Steve remained humble, acknowledging that he was still learning himself. He often reflected publicly on how much the experiment had changed him, reminding audiences that real change started with listening and understanding. By stepping outside his comfort zone, he had uncovered truths that challenged stereotypes and forced people to confront uncomfortable realities. And alongside Maria, he proved that even small acts of compassion could inspire monumental shifts. As weeks turned into months, the impact of Steve's experiment continued to grow. What began as a personal quest to test humanity had evolved into a movement, one rooted in empathy, connection, and collective responsibility. For Steve, the journey wasn't over. If anything, it had only deepened his commitment to leaving the world better than he found it. As the dust settled on his social experiment, Steve Harvey found himself reflecting deeply on everything he had experienced. The journey had been far more intense and transformative than he ever imagined. What started as a bold idea to test how society treated its most vulnerable members had become a profound lesson in humility, empathy, and self-awareness. For Steve, it wasn't just about stepping into someone else's shoes. It was about understanding the weight those shoes carried every single day. One of the biggest realizations for Steve was how easy it was to lose one's identity when stripped of societal markers like wealth, status, or even basic cleanliness. In his everyday life, people flocked to him, eager to shake his hand, take a photo, or share a laugh. But as a homeless man, he became invisible, just another figure blending into the background noise of the city. This stark contrast made him question how often he, too, might have overlooked someone in need without realizing it. It forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that privilege could blind people to the struggles of others unless they actively chose to see them. Steve also learned that kindness wasn't always loud or grand. Sometimes it came in quiet, unexpected ways. He thought back to the elderly man who shared half his sandwich, the child who smiled despite her mother's warnings, and Maria, whose unwavering compassion reignited his faith in humanity. These moments reminded him that goodness existed everywhere. You just had to pay attention. And yet, for every act of kindness, there were countless instances of neglect, judgment, and indifference. That duality stayed with him, a constant reminder of the work still needed to bridge the gap between us and them. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of the experiment was seeing how quickly his own confidence wavered when faced with adversity. As a successful entertainer, Steve was used to commanding rooms, making decisions, and solving problems with ease. But living on the streets left him feeling powerless and uncertain, relying on strangers for scraps of food or a fleeting sense of safety. It gave him a newfound appreciation for the strength and resilience required to survive such conditions, day after day. He realized that homelessness wasn't just about lacking shelter, it was about battling loneliness, stigma, and the crushing weight of being unseen. The experiment also reinforced the importance of using his platform responsibly. Before this journey, Steve had always believed in giving back. But now he understood the depth of impact he could make by shining a light on issues often ignored. Partnering with Maria hadn't just helped her achieve her dreams, it had shown him the ripple effect of investing in others. Every donation, every conversation, every policy change inspired by their campaign was proof that collective action mattered. Looking ahead, Steve knew his work wasn't done. While the immediate attention brought by his experiment had sparked change, he recognized that true progress took time and persistence. He committed to staying involved, not just through financial contributions but by continuing to listen, learn, and advocate. Whether it was hosting more community forums, amplifying voices from marginalized groups, or simply encouraging his audience to practice empathy in their daily lives, Steve vowed to keep pushing forward. In the end, the experiment changed Steve. in ways he couldn't have predicted. It stripped away layers of complacency, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and society. Yet it also filled him with hope that people could grow, that systems could improve, and that humanity could rise above its flaws. For all the challenges he faced, Steve walked away with a renewed sense of purpose and gratitude. As he sat in his home one evening, scrolling through messages from fans inspired by his journey, Steve smiled softly. He thought about Maria, the shelters bustling with volunteers, and the growing momentum behind initiatives to support the unhoused. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a beginning of seeing the world differently, of challenging assumptions, and of proving that even small actions could lead to big changes. And for Steve Harvey, that was worth every moment of discomfort.